Tapatrayo Pashamanaya Vayam Bhajema. Excellent. Jnanam, knowledge. Yat, which. Etat, this. Adhat, gave. Katamaha, who other than. Saha, that. Devaha, the personality of Godhead. Trikalikam, of the three phases of time. Sthirachareshu, in the inanimate and animate objects. Anuvartita, dwelling. Amsha, his partial representation. Tam, unto him. Jiva, of the jiva souls. Karma padavim, the path of fruitive activities. Anuvartamana, who are pursuing. Tapatraya, from the threefold miseries. Upashamanaya, for getting free. Vayam, we. Bhajema, must surrender. Translation by Srila Prabhupada ki jai. No other than the Supreme Personality of Godhead, as the localized Paramatma, the partial representation of the Lord, is directing all inanimate and animate objects. He is present in the three phases of time, past, present, and future. Therefore, the conditioned soul is engaged in different activities by his direction, and in order to get free from the threefold miseries of this conditional life, we have to surrender unto him only. Purport by Srila Prabhupada ki jai. When a conditioned soul is seriously anxious to get out of the influence of the material clutches, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is situated within him as Paramatma, gives him this knowledge. Quote, surrender unto me. So when a conditioned soul is seriously anxious to get out of the influence of the material clutches, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is situated within him as Paramatma, gives him this knowledge, quote unquote, surrender unto me. As the Lord says in Bhagavad Gita, give up all other engagements, just surrender unto me. It is to be accepted that the source of knowledge is the Supreme Person. This is also confirmed in Bhagavad Gita. Mattaha smantir jnanam apoanam cha. The Lord says, through me one gets real knowledge and memory, and one also forgets through me. To one who wants to be materially satisfied or who wants to lord it over material nature, the Lord gives the opportunity to forget his service and engage in the so-called happiness of material activities. Similarly, when one is frustrated in lording it over material nature and is very serious about getting out of this material entanglement, the Lord from within gives him the knowledge that he has to surrender unto him. Then there is liberation. This knowledge cannot be imparted by anyone other than the Supreme Lord or his representative. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Lord Chaitanya instructs Rupa Goswami that the living entities wander in life after life, undergoing the miserable conditions of material existence. But when one is very anxious to get free from the material entanglement, he gets enlightenment through a spiritual master in Krishna. This means that Krishna, as the Supersoul, is seated within the heart of the living entity. And when the living entity is serious, the Lord directs him to take shelter of his representative, a bona fide spiritual master. Directed from within and guided externally by the spiritual master, one attains the path of Krishna consciousness, which is the way out of the material clutches. Therefore, there is no possibility of one's being situated in his own position unless he is blessed by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Unless he is enlightened with supreme knowledge, one has to undergo the severe penalties of the hard struggle for existence in the material nature. The spiritual master is therefore the mercy manifestation of the Supreme Person. I'm going to read that again. The spiritual master is therefore the mercy manifestation of the Supreme Person. The conditioned soul has to take direct instruction from the spiritual master, and thus he gradually becomes enlightened to the path of Krishna consciousness. The seed of Krishna consciousness is sown within the heart of the conditioned soul, and when one hears instruction from the spiritual master, the seed fructifies, and one's life is blessed. Jai. Om Nyanati Marandasya Nananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namahan. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadada Hara Srivasari Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. I was born in the darkest of ignorance, and my spiritual master kindly forced open my eyes with the torchlight of knowledge. I offer my humble obeisances to such a spiritual master. Translation again, and this is the third canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, the cream of all the Vedic literature, the ripened fruit of the tree of Vedic knowledge, Srimad Bhagavatam, the Bhagavat Purana, the third canto, which is thought of as the teachings of Lord Kapila, which is presenting the bona fide Sankhya philosophy. Chapter 31, the movements of the living entities, text number 16. Translation again, no one other than the Supreme Personality of Godhead as the localized Param Atma, the partial representation of the Lord, is directing all inanimate and animate objects. No one other than him, no one other than Krishna as the Paramatma is directing all animate and inanimate objects. As we say, not a blade of grass moves without the sanction of Krishna. That's because Paramatma, Krishna's partial representation, is in every blade of grass, right? Anyway. He is present in the three phases of time, past, present, and future. Therefore, the conditioned soul is engaged in different activities by his direction. And in order to get free from the threefold miseries of this conditional life, we have to surrender unto him only. Jai. So the word that Prabhupada often uses for partial representation of the Lord is plenary. You guys remember that from reading that in the Bhagavatam? The word plenary, Plenary, plenary portion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And so he didn't actually use that word in this particular verse, although maybe he does in one of the other ones. But the definition of that word describes what these things mean very well. One of the kind of purposes of giving the class is to explain what the words mean, so that we don't just kind of go to sleep with platitudes, right? Like a platitude is a word that people use because it sounds good, but not everybody really understands the meaning. And if there's not an explanation of what the words mean, then it's easy just for the mind to go to sleep. So I'll just explain. Prabhupada very often, even though here he just says the partial representation of the Lord, he often uses the word plenary. And plenary, it comes from the word for full. So we get the same word plentiful and plenary. And plen is the root of both of those words. And it comes from the word for full. And and its meaning, in like the reason that word came into usage in the beginning, plenary, was mostly in governance and government of any kind these days for corporations and also actual government bodies, but in the past mostly from government bodies, because these are words that come through us through Latin and Greek. Of course, the original root is Sanskrit, but because Greek and Latin are just Sanskrit. But plenary means the full power within just a part that's present, is what plenary means. So in in a government operation, in the actual operation of the government, then you have what are called plenary meetings. And a plenary meeting means that everybody who's supposed to be there to represent the full representation of the government is not there. There's only some of the people there. But the meeting is still considered to have the full force and power, and does have the full force and power of the government or the corporation, even though there's not the full representation of everybody who could be there is actually there. So, like for instance, the king is not there, but the king's ministers are all meeting, and they've been specifically empowered by the whole structure, the whole setup of the government, that they're representing the full power of the king when they meet, even though the king is on the battlefield or doing whatever, because the king has empowered them with his full power. That's a plenary meeting of those ministers. So it means that, like Prabhupada says here, a partial representation, but the partial representation, Prabhupada always explains throughout the Bhagavatam, has the full power. So Prabhupada's always explaining that Krishna is the original, but Lord Vishnu is still a fully plenary, powerful incarnation of Krishna, right? There's no difference between Krishna and Lord Vishnu in terms of their ultimate capacity for power. Vishnu is Krishna, Krishna is Vishnu. Same thing with Paramatma in your heart. Paramatma in your heart is Krishna, right? Prabhupada's here describing Paramatma as a partial representation, but that's always described elsewhere in the Bhagavatam as a plenary representation of Krishna. Plenary meaning that not everything is manifest, not everything is there of Krishna, because Paramatma is sitting in your heart, very small. And Paramatma actually is one of the incarnations of one of the many expansions of Lord Vishnu, so of which there are a great many. And each expansion of Lord Vishnu has its own particular role to play. So it's manifesting in a particular role, but it's not without the full, the plenary or the full potency of Krishna. And that's why that partial incarnation or representation of Krishna can do the job perfectly, right? It's not that it's partial and therefore it's limited in what and how it can get the job done. Otherwise, how would the world function? The world needs divine perfection in order to function, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that just make sense? We actually know from the astrophysicists, from the material scientists, that if, I think it's some incredibly small number, like 0.1% of the universe, or even 0.001%, I forget what the actual number is, but it's very small, of the matter in the universe was differently ordered, that the whole universe would just fly apart. So what's holding the universe together? What the Greeks call the divine logos, we call the Paramatma. That the divine reason, the divine intelligence, the logos, is invested in the world. And by studying the world, that's why we have terms like geology, the study of the earth, the reasonable rational ordering, the structuring of the earth. But a structure, in order for something to be ordered, there has to be an intention, right? Otherwise there's no order, is there? If you're going to study anything, even in science, it's because you're studying something that has intention behind it. Otherwise, you can't be studying it as an ology. People forget this when they decide they're going to be influenced by their, kind of somewhat weird, maybe psychologically deficient in some ways, like atheist Marxist professors in university, and they decide, not interested in my old-timey religion anymore, I'm gonna become one of these college-educated atheists or agnostics. They forget to realize that their college professors have a PhD in an ology most of the time. And an ology comes from the word logos, which means divine order. That's what it means. It means divine, rational, reasonable intelligence that's been invested into the world. And therefore the world is knowable as a structure, as an order. That's just what ology means. And then they put geo in front of it, like earth, for the discovery of the ordering of the earth. Or they put bio in front of it for the discovery of the structure of how life manifests in matter, right? How we take on bodies, that's biology, right? So these are all the ologies. And so behind any order, there has to be, by definition, a structure. In other words, behind any structure or order, there has to be an intent. Otherwise, it's not ordered, right? Order means that somebody intended for it to be a particular way. That's just what order means. And so if you're doing an ology, you're doing the study of order. That word, logos, is a Greek word, and it actually comes from the original, earlier Sanskrit root, which is leg, which is, by the way, the same root word for religion. So we get re, R-E, and then ligios is Latin, but that comes down from Greek and Sanskrit, which is the Sanskrit root leg, which means it basically means the boundaries. It means the line. Leg literally means line. So it means what gives boundary to something. Because you don't really, one of the reasons why the deities here are so beautiful, they're so captivating, they like take over your mind, is because they're formed. They have boundary. They have intent to how they want it to look. And you can't have intent without lines, without boundaries. In other words, without a distinction of one class of something from another, without a distinction of one category from another, of space, of time, of function, of purpose. So, and when you order all of these realities, all these lined differences of reality. Here's another interesting tidbit, since we're talking about these words, these sentences that Prabhupada is using and their actual meaning. Instead of just as platitudes, it's really helpful to actually think about, why did Prabhupada use those words? What do the words mean? That's what having an education is, where you're able to make connections between the words that are being presented, rather than just go to sleep on a bunch of platitudes, right? So, this is an interesting fact. Since religion means legios, or legios, which means literally to redraw the lines. That's basically what it means. To be revivified, to bring life back to the ordering or the lines or the instructions. That's why Prabhupada ends the whole thing with Krishna saying, just surrender unto me. Paramatma within your heart is saying, surrender unto me. Surrender under what? Surrendering under the divine intention, the divine plan, right? The divine ordering of everything. The Greeks called that the logos, and we have sciences, whole universities trying to train people to be atheists and Marxists these days that are teaching ologies. That's what they have their PhD in. Here's an interesting little tidbit for those who appreciate that we just chanted all this Sanskrit. Why'd Prabhupada make us chant the Sanskrit, right? Sanskrit's the only language in the world where the word Sanskrit itself, the name for the language, has a meaning in the language, and it's not just the name of the people who spoke the language. Greek just means those who speak Greek, right? Latin just means the Latin people, those who speak Latin, right? Or the language of those who speak, of those people, the language of the Greeks. That's what Greek means. Spanish means the language of Espanol, of Spain. But Sanskrit doesn't mean the language of those people. Sanskrit has a meaning literally in the root of the word. The roots of the word Sanskrit itself literally means that which is highly refined, or a relationship. It's because son means, it's the same word in Greek, comes down through Greek as sin, which means together. Son literally means together. And krita means to be made or formed. So it literally means to be together formed, to have a relationship with what is fine. That's what literally, so when you engage in the Sanskrit, it's making you smarter. That's nice. Prabhupada has given us this whole culture, but it's not based in Sanskrit for no reason. Prabhupada could have just said, okay, I'll translate it all into English and just read that, don't worry about the Sanskrit. He could have said that, but he didn't. Instead, when we have class, we have a format, right? He ordered it, Prabhupada ordered it in a particular way, right? We have a spiritualology that we are following, Prabhupada's morning program. It's in Sanskrit. Sanskrit's always on the board. I didn't put the English up there, did I? We all repeated the Sanskrit. Why? Because it is literally making you religious. Religion just literally means to be reformed, to be reordered, to have your life be brought back to the lines, the borders, the boundaries of the divine plan, of a relationship with the divine plan. It's literally what religion means. Of course, there's different levels. There's a hierarchy of knowledge. Ultimately, there's Krishna prema. We pray every morning, to not make offenses and therefore stay within the bounds of what creates a field of possibility for ultimately attaining Krishna prema, pure love of God, without any even any awe or reverence, just in a pure exchange like the saints have always had. So these words matter a lot, and the reason I went through all that sort of linguistics, sorry, if you have to run screaming from the room, I'll understand, is because what is Paramatma? Paramatma is a plenary portion of Krishna. Plenary means fully vested, and so Paramatma is in every atom of the universe. We know, right? When we read the Bhagavatam, we read about Kshirdakshaya Vishnu, invested in every atom of the universe, including in the heart of the living entities, this plenary portion of Krishna. And so that allows there to be this ordering, that the full intention of Krishna, yes, Krishna has his own pastimes, Krishna Loka, Vrindavan, Krishna is the thief. We sing that incredible song in this Purushottama time period, and I even had to copy down one of the verses because it was so incredible. We had this program the other night. I'll just read it for you. There's Krishna, and we have this incredible I lost it. Anyway, incredible verse. Krishna, you have stolen my heart. You are the thief. Now, sorry, but you're imprisoned in the darkness, in the dark prison of my heart. Krishna is this extraordinary personality ultimately. And yet at the same time, through all of these different expansions that we read about in the Bhagavatam, Krishna is his divine intention is reaching even into the material world, which is what orders free will, basically. What's the difference between the categories of the spiritual and material world? That there's a boundary, right? There's a line. Religion literally means line. There's a boundary between the spiritual and the material world. In other words, boundary means that there's one thing over here, there's one thing over there. They're not the same, okay? Right? Like our philosophy is achintya beta beta tattva. So simultaneous oneness and difference. That there's a oneness of Krishna, but Krishna is able to expand himself into distinctions, into distinct varieties. And that those exist both in the spiritual world and obviously here in the material world, because nothing's the same in the material world, we know that, right? They're all different levels of intelligence, beauty, power, everything we see in the material world has a difference. But that's also true in the spiritual world. But in the spiritual world, things don't have an attachment to their being different. Anyway, that's a longer story I want to get into today. But I will just mention that this intention, when you have something ordered, it means there's an intention behind it. So there's no reason to be intimidated by, philosophical materialism, because a philosophically materialist professor is only proud of themselves because they're studying an ology, which literally means that which is ordered, and anytime there's an ordering, there has to be an intention. It means there's consciousness there. And if you're talking about the ordering of the universe, that's much bigger than any one professor in your university, obviously. The natural, so-called natural laws everyone's studying, there's no reason to be intimidated because there has to be a superior intention behind all this order. That's what the word means. I'm not making that up as my belief. I'm just talking about what the words mean, right? So if we're going to have a conversation in the university about education, we're only doing it in words. So there's no reason for people who are, attached to getting the nectar and are dancing here in ecstasy. There's no reason to be intimidated when you go back out into the world. Just hide out in the temple all the time because this is where the nectar is, and out there in the horrible world, it's not like that. There's no reason to be intimidated by the outside world because people are only talking to you in the outside world in words that mean something. And the meaning of all these words all goes back to Krishna. It just does. Language is part of itself. Linguistics, language, the study of language is part of the divine plan itself, which makes it so nice when you look up Srila Prabhupada's, what the words mean that Srila Prabhupada uses, what his sentences are really saying, and you just think about them. You go to the dictionary, which I highly recommend. I highly recommend Edym Online, ETYMONLINE, online.com. It's all one word. It'll give you the Sanskrit roots for practically every English or Spanish or whatever your language is word. Almost all the European languages, except for Finnish and Hungarian, derive from Sanskrit. Every European language, including the Slavic languages and Russian and what they call the Cyrillic languages, they all derive from Sanskrit. So you can go to Edym Online and see what the roots are. You'll see the Latin and Greek roots too, but we now know the Latin and Greek just come from Sanskrit. And that's exciting. And you can start to see, Prabhupada had a really good education. And so when he writes in English, his sentences have a deeper meaning than just the platitudes of, hey, Prabhu, surrender, or Paramatma's partial representation. The words actually go back to the same meanings that all the people that we encounter out in the world, whether they realize it or not, are using those meanings. And I'll just finish this by discussing, Prabhupada talks in here about a bona fide spiritual master. And Prabhupada uses bona fide a lot. He uses the word to describe the Srimad Bhagavatam as the summum bonum. Krishna is the summum bonum, or the highest good. Bhagavatam presents the summum bonum. The Bhagavatam doesn't present just so-called religion in the sense of just an ordering of rituals or even sacraments. It presents, which are fine and good and wonderful, but it presents the summum bonum. It presents the highest good. And so there's one of the things to understand is that when you hear about Paramatma or even the discussion of the deities, this isn't, if you were raised in especially here in the West, New Zealand's a Western country, the Western, Christian culture behind it. we often are, again, kind of intimidated by these kind of cultural memes that, if you talk about the deities or you talk about a Paramatma within your heart, that this is some sort of polytheism or, some kind of weird version of idol worship or this and that, that you're really just sort of, for some reason, you've become superstitious and now you're wearing like these bed sheets, or you've put some marking on your head. Although the Christians do that too. It's called Ash Wednesday, and they mark their foreheads with the ash. But nevertheless, we get sort of under assault from our Marxist professors in the university, or just from the general sort of Christian culture out there, that somehow, what is this? It's all just superstition, polytheism, idol worshiping, and things like that. Because there's these descriptions in the Bhagavatam like Paramatma, and what about one true God? Of course, Paramatma literally means plenary, which does mean one unified God. So, which, by the way, if you think about Christianity, that's what the word Catholic means. All it means is one. It just means one unified, God and God's people together, God's devotees in oneness. That's what Catholic means. Universal in that sense. So we have that too, Chincha Beta Beta Tattva, simultaneously one, but with infinite spiritual varieties, or everything's ultimately personal. So Krishna is a person, and so one of the problems that we have is that, kind of things like polytheism, that's just like a superstitious, you didn't understand nature, you saw a lightning bolt coming down from the sky and hitting the mountain, and you thought, we have to describe some polytheism to that, or that's just like, so therefore we make up a story about Zeus with his thunderbolt, or Thor with his thunderbolt hammer, right? Or Indra with his thunderbolt, right? So, so therefore, people who kind of view religions as a unable to reason, and therefore can only resort to violence because they can't rationally prove anything materially in the world. Therefore, the only way they get their culture across is through violence. That's a real objection people have to religion today, and justifiably so. Even though it's not ultimately correct, which I'm going to point out. People have this reaction. They have these reactions that, this whole idea of these gods is, they're taking up space. They're coming and forcing me to do something. This kind of Old Testament, God that smites people who aren't the right people, this and that. And like there's a competition. And the idea is that Prabhupada, when he uses words like summum bonum, he's not using summum for no reason. Prabhupada he had a very good education. He had a Christian education from Christian teachers at Scottish Church College in Calcutta. And so when he writes in the Bhagavatam, you should pay attention. Prabhupada doesn't write anything in the Bhagavatam where the sentences don't mean something in the language, the culture, and the history of this planet. Not just the Vedic history. The Bhagavatam presents the Vedic history, but Prabhupada's purports are all written so that people who have lived in Kali Yuga's history can understand the Bhagavatam. And he uses words for a real purpose, like summum bonum. When you use the word summum, you're basically invoking a very famous and extraordinary Western philosopher named Thomas Aquinas, who used the word summum in a discussion to as basically what they call apologetics, which means a defense of God, a defense of one supernatural, supreme God, like Krishna, for instance, who's not a polytheism, isn't idol worship, isn't just some kind of nature story explanation, supernaturalism. And so when you see bona fide, summum bonum, these Latin words, it's directly harking back to the high Middle Ages and some very extraordinary thinkers and philosophers who really shaped Western culture and civilization. And so Thomas Aquinas had an explanation of, look, when you're hearing explanations of things like how God can enter into this world as, like Paramatma. I mean, Aquinas didn't say Paramatma, but it's like a burning bush, that's something called, not something called, what Aquinas called en summum. That word summum. It's probably, when he says summum bonum, he's directly alluding to a whole way of thinking about theology that comes from the Western tradition. Otherwise, he would have used a Sanskrit word, not a Latin word, and he wouldn't have used Latin words specifically made famous by Thomas Aquinas, who Prabhupada would have studied at Scottish Church College. Anyway, so Thomas Aquinas uses this word en summum, which means God as a being in this world. Summum just means the highest. So in other words, the highest being, but in this world. Like there's a competition of beings in this world, and you're going to lose to the highest one and have to compete with that person. And Thomas Aquinas pointed out, no, that's not what it is. That there's another way of looking at it, which is also a Latin phrase, which is ipsum esse subsistens, which means God as the act of being itself. Ipsum means itself, that itself. And esse means being, it's another word for being. Ens also means being. Summum means the highest being, but like ens means being now in this material world. So it would be like a competition. So, and people naturally react to this, like, Zeus with his thunderbolt, or Indra with his thunderbolt. It's just like we're in competition. There's like this, kind of higher level maybe competition, and they're interfering in the life here on humanity. It's like Homer's Iliad. There's these kind of adolescent gods that are coming, and without any rhyme or reason, without any order, without any intent, ordered intent, without any philosophy behind them. They're just interfering in the world. Like Indra just starts, he just starts pouring the rain down on the residents of Vrindavan because they're in competition with him. They're worshiping this hill instead of him, right? And so that's en summum. When Prabhupada talks about the summum bonum, he's directly alluding to that. That's kind of what you could call unphilosophical or false way of thinking about the powers in the world. Like we talked about plenary. Plenary means completely full of all the power of God, of the divine, of Krishna. So, and if you have an en summum idea of where your place is in the universe, you're done for. So that's why they call him Saint Thomas Aquinas. He said, no, use another Latin phrase. It's ipsum esse subsistens, which means God is that act of being itself is God. So is Krishna. That it's that act of beingness itself. It's not something that comes to being in this material world. It literally is the act of being itself. So there's not in other words, Krishna is supernatural. Krishna doesn't have a material body. Krishna is not just en summum. A lot of people, even in India, who have a kind of basic cultural respect for Krishna, in a way because they were forced to, have the misunderstanding. And the Bhagavatam is always expunging this misunderstanding from the consciousness of people who encounter it, that Krishna has a material body and is just some sort of supreme king who is just more powerful than all the other kings, but, is just takes on a material, he's just a material manifestation with a material body who is just some great king. And no, the Bhagavatam explains, actually, Krishna is ipsum esse subsistens. Krishna is the act of beingness itself, the act of being from which the potential to be a king actually originally flows from, and has its source, has its basis. So that all other categories have their basis originally in the act of being itself. So that's a much bigger topic I won't get into any further, but I just wanted to point it out because Prabhupada uses this word bona fide to talk about the spiritual master, who's another kind of plenary representation, not in the same way as a direct incarnation of Krishna like Paramatma, but represents Krishna in this world, and therefore we try to develop our refinement of our relationship with the spiritual master according to certain practices and certain rules. Like, that's how we end up with a word called religion, and a spiritual teacher fits into a religion. So it's nice to realize that the Bhagavatam is not, especially Prabhupada's purports, are not disconnected from the other monotheistic religions out there. Of course, we recognize there is a hierarchy of knowledge that, if you don't want to have to eat meat, and you are attracted, Krishna literally means all attractive, you're attracted to the life of Krishna. It's funny, we're also not competing. This whole idea of competing isn't what Krishna consciousness is about. Krishna consciousness, Bhakti Yoga is not a competition. We're not even in competition with other religions because there aren't any other religions that make the claim that God himself, in his original form, his original supernatural spiritual form, not en summums, but ipsum esse subsistens, his original form, what we call Satchit Ananda Vigraha, Krishna in his Vigraha, his spiritual form. We're the only so-called religion that makes the claim that God himself comes to this world and lives a full life as himself in his own spiritual body, and doesn't come as a prophet or come as a partial plenary manifestation like his son, or the Brahmajyoti, or the cosmic Om vibration, or what they call the Holy Spirit in Christianity, that not just that fully empowered incarnation or portion of Krishna comes, but that, or as a burning bush or one of these things, but that God himself, as a person, because there are other personal religions on the planet, and we're not competing with them, because we're the only tradition that claims that Krishna himself came and lived a full life on this planet. So, we're not actually competing. Because yes, we agree, Krishna did send other prophets, and that, Krishna can send his incarnations and can send his son, can send the divine logos into the world. We don't argue with that at all. But we do say that, hey, there's a hierarchy of knowledge, that, ultimately Krishna, everyone is following Krishna's path. But you can take the direct path if you like. If you're attracted to Krishna, then you're not going to miss out on anything. You're definitely not going to miss out on any of the history of the planet of the intellectual culture and history of the planet, you're not going to miss out on any of it if you take to the Bhagavatam, because the Bhagavatam is presented to us and must be presented to us through a bona fide authority, a bona fide representative in a direct line of disciplic succession. And for us, that is Srila Prabhupada. And Srila Prabhupada's purports all are explaining, if you bother to look up what the words mean, you go to the etymology, what the sentences mean. Prabhupada explains in his purports, really, you get the whole intellectual history of the planet. That's why when I teach the teenagers, we just read the Bhagavatam and a few other things. But, I don't inundate them all with all kinds of, survey of every nonsense. Quite frankly, a lot of them are demented and just despicable works of literature, especially modern literature out there, because it's not necessary. The Bhagavatam, it's not necessary for an intellectual life to poison your mind with nonsense, because the Bhagavatam is perfectly sufficient. Srila Prabhupada did not deny us anything. You're not going to end up some sort of stunted, fanatical, culty, religious person if you concentrate on the Bhagavatam. If you actually look up what the words mean in the dictionary and you go to like Edam Online and you see what the Sanskrit means, maybe you look into, the linguistics behind Sanskrit, like what the history of it is, and you look up what all these Latin phrases are that Prabhupada is using, they all have a tradition, an intellectual tradition of apologetics within the other Western traditions on the planet that Prabhupada understood well because he was trained at Scottish Church College. They're all allusions. They're everywhere in the Bhagavatam to a very rich intellectual tradition of apologetics. Apologetics means defense of God as a person. That's literally what it means. So it's a Greek word, means defense. It doesn't mean I'm sorry. It means defense. So Prabhupada has apologetics all through the Bhagavatam. You get all the rich intellectual history of the planet through Prabhupada's purports in the Bhagavatam. Prabhupada did not deny us anything. So you don't have to feel like, if I let my kids, come and study with Nitai Chan, they'll just read the Bhagavatam, they won't be able to go to university, they won't get a job, they won't be able to intellectually function in the rest of the Western world. That is not true. Prabhupada has the whole intellectual history, the whole intellectual culture of the Western world that you're afraid your kids might miss out on within the Bhagavatam, if you bother to look up what the words mean and think about what Prabhupada's sentences really mean, what Prabhupada's life was and meant. Why do we have Prabhupada's Lilamrita? Is it just to get nectar stories? Is that it? Is it just to have a hagiography of Prabhupada? Maybe it's because we can actually understand that Prabhupada had a role to play within the Western world, and therefore he had a Western education, which he's populated the pages of the Bhagavatam with, which your children will not miss out on anything if they study it. I mean, my daughter is finishing the Bhagavatam now, she's getting near the end, and she hasn't missed out on anything. She's going to university early, maybe. We'll see what Krishna desires. So my point is that the whole intellectual history of the planet, not just the Vedic, obviously we have a hierarchy of knowledge. We know the Vedic times are higher, they're more attractive, they're more sophisticated, philosophically rich, but it doesn't deny that people didn't think anything in Kali Yuga, and Prabhupada didn't deny that either. That's why he laced all his purports everywhere with allusions to thinkers and terminology, which we call hermeneutics, by the way, if you want to look up another word. I'll just end finally with this. Bir Krishna once told me, I asked him, how are we going to explain some of this more extreme stuff that Prabhupada says, and a tiny bit that the Bhagavatam itself in his translation says, to kind of the woke world out there, that the world has changed so much. And Bir Krishna looked at me and he said, one word. He said, hermeneutics, or we won't have a movement. And so anyway, I try and make my classes a bit more hermeneutical, explaining who Prabhupada was in his own life. Prabhupada didn't step out of the pages of the Bhagavatam in this lifetime. He stepped into Scottish Church College for a reason, so he could write the purports of the Bhagavatam, 18 volumes of it in a particular way, not to mention the Chaitanya Charitamrita. So, and there's a whole rich intellectual culture there if you want to study it. Idam Bhagavatam Nama Puranam Brahmasamatam Uttamashloka Charitam Chakra Bhagavan Rishe Nishraya Sayalokasya Danyam Swastayanam Mahat. Their Srimad Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of God. It is compiled by Srila Vyasadeva, the incarnation of God. It is meant for the ultimate good of all people. It is all perfect, all successful, and all blissful. In the purport of that verse of the Bhagavatam, Prabhupada says, by the study of the Bhagavatam, one can derive all the benefits that are possible to be derived from the personal presence of the Lord. It carries with it all transcendental blessings of Lord Sri Krishna that we can expect from his personal contact. And that includes Prabhupada's purports, which are a part of the Bhagavatam too. So, which are the rich intellectual history of planet Earth and the Western world that you want your kids to grow up and get a job in. So the Bhagavatam's not going to keep your kids from getting a job. That is absolutely ridiculous. The Bhagavatam will elevate your children to be able to think, and us ourselves. That's why we have a morning program where we read it, and we have to read the Sanskrit. It's up there on the wall. Prabhupada quotes the Latin and the Greek, because these are refined languages that make us smarter and allow us to be able to think. Thinking's a lot of fun too. So, all right. Grantharaj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Thank you for your kind attention. Radhagiri Dari is so beautiful today, all attractive.